Hello, everyone, and welcome to Matchbook Flashback. I'm your host, Alec Ogg, and I've got this big collection of old matchbooks I bought at an estate sale recently. They're here in this big glass jar. The matches are all different colors and designs from all different times and places. But the thing is, when I strike each match, the flame begins to swirl hypnotically, and if you look into the flame, you can see a story unfolding in there, trapped like a memory in the matchbook. Well, let's do one. I'm excited to test one out today. See if there's a story inside. Okay, I got one. This is a rust-colored matchbook, and it has some dark green forest icons on it. And in yellow print, it reads, Jemez Mountains. Jemez. Jemez. That's an area in New Mexico. It's north of Albuquerque. You got the Santa Fe National Forest up there. This matchbook's colors do a good job of depicting the landscape of that area. Red Mesa Mountains covered in dark green ponderosa pine forests. There's also beautiful, clear, natural hot springs up there. The Jemez Hot Springs. But this area, the Jemez Springs, reminds me of a news story I saw a few months ago, in October of 2023, of a missing person.
It was 3 weeks ago today. The woman on the right had a feeling she should call her twin sister. Yes, that would be the woman on the left. Since then, no one has seen or heard from that second twin from Albuquerque. And now there is a mystery in the mountains near Jemez Springs. What happened to Ingrid Lane? And can anybody explain what was found in her car?
Those are the questions that motivated her family to drive across the country. And now a mother and daughter are spending the next week in our state looking for answers.
Ingrid Lane was last seen more than 3 weeks ago in a remote part of the Jemez wilderness.
The Monday after she went missing, I felt like I needed to call her and we needed to talk. That certainly haunts me a little bit, like what was happening on that Monday.
Kelsey and her mom, Becky Lane, just arrived to New Mexico from Oregon. They made the drive and planned to use the more than $25,000 from a GoFundMe to find Ingrid. They are hoping for a tip.
Hopefully, somebody might have just given her a ride.
On October 15th, Ingrid went to the Zen Center in Jemez Springs. That Sunday afternoon, a couple hunters spotted her on a remote forest road with a flat tire. She apparently told them she was determined to hike to a nearby peak. They found her car, and her husband says there are some weird things inside. The rear window of her car was shattered, and an out-of-place rock was in the back seat.
She weighs like 120 pounds, so I was like, I don't think she could get that rock through there on her own. So that was weird. That's super weird. And she's not like a violent person.
Cash and electronics were still in the car.
I don't know. I'm perplexed. I feel like those are the things where I go, wait, what happened?
While her family says she was struggling with her mental health and at a career crossroads, her sister says
the way that she was making plans, even for the next week and for the future, I don't think that she went into the mountains not planning to come back.
Renting a search helicopter, hiring a private investigator, everything is on the table.
A lieutenant with the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office says this is an active missing persons case and there is no evidence of foul play.
I'll link that KOB4 report in the show notes, and a picture of the giant rock that was possibly thrown through her back window. Very strange. I read on disappearedblog.com that with the help of canine units, drone searches, and helicopter searches over those Red Mesa Mountains and green forests, there are still no further clues about her whereabouts. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's strike one of these matches from the Jemez Mountain Matchbook. When I light it, I need you to look deeply into the flame. That's where the story is. Look deeply into the flame.
this whole thing started for me back in January of 2000, so 24 years ago, I guess it is. I was living and working in Western Maryland, and the young lady that I dated had two small children, and we found ourselves on a January day, a particular warm day, up to about 60 degrees or so. And in the foothills of the Appalachians, when you get a warm day during winter, you don't waste it. So our idea was to go out on a picnic with her kids. And we went out that afternoon, and that turned into, an afternoon of visiting friends afterward and then going out to dinner. We ended up getting in kind of late, about somewhere between 9 and 10. And the way her house is situated, she lives, lived out in, out in the woods. Basically, the area where she lived was kind of hacked out of a area of woods, and she lived up on top of a little hill there, and the driveway went up the hill and actually encircled her house. So the part that we always used was the part of the driveway that was between her house and and the tree line, basically about 40 feet from the tree line. So we parked, got out, and immediately we could hear something big moving through the woods. And this is, a vast area of woods that's out there in Western Maryland, and the woods themselves are very dark. And the reason being is the canopy of the trees hung down very low to about 5 feet, and then the tree line was lined with bushes and briars, pretty much. And so looking in there, there's nothing to see. You just couldn't see anything. All you heard was something very big moving around, moving across the leaf litter that was on the ground. And when you hear something big moving in the woods out there, you think black bear. There's really nothing else out there that is able to sound like that. And so we took it to be a black bear, and we didn't want any part of that. So she hustled her children inside very quickly to get them upstairs to go to bed. And it was my job to get all of the dishes and every leftover food and everything from the picnic into the house. And I didn't want to take 2 trips. So I loaded up my arms and had everything there just to get inside. And all that was left to get the hatchback on her car down was my elbow. So my right elbow, I pressed down on the hatchback and got it down, and then ran inside, and everything was good. After a few minutes, she came back downstairs and went to the back door to look for the bear, see if she could see it. And all she could really see was that my elbow is incredibly inefficient when it comes to lowering a hatchback, because the dome light in her car was on. And somebody had to go out there so her battery wouldn't run down and everything like that. I really wasn't going to make her do that, because, chivalry's not dead in my heart. So I was the one who got to go out there. And the problem was, I was inside. My eyes had adjusted to the light. Everything was, all there. So what I did is I went to the back door and I turned out the porch light, and I turned out the light there that was in the mudroom that was there just inside the house. And I just stared out the window, trying to get my eyes to readjust to the darkness as best I could. Because if a black bear was coming my way, I definitely wanted to be able to see something. I did not want to be out there almost completely blind. What I discovered after a couple of minutes was that there was a lot more light than I gave credit for. There was a strong amount of moonlight. I can't recall whether it was a full moon or something very close to a full moon, but it was one of those two, because it was very bright. The moonlight was. There was also a lamppost that was about 200 feet to the left that was there to illuminate that part of the driveway so you wouldn't drive off. So you made the right turn that would go over towards the house without going off of the driveway. So there was some ambient light, enough to feel comfortable about seeing out there. So when I stepped outside, my eyes went immediately to one point off to my right on the tree line. And the reason my eyes were there is because that was the one spot in the tree line where the bushes and briars had either been pulled out or beaten down, and there was a space there about 15 feet wide. And that was where we used to go back into the woods to take our kids hiking or go play in the woods or whatever we do. Unbeknownst to me at that moment, that was also the place where my girlfriend would take food that was about to go bad and dump it out there so animals could eat it. So it was a natural place for for the animal to show up. And I knew that a bear wasn't going to try and come through the bushes and briars to get at me. So it would have to be that spot. Bears aren't going to hurt themselves just trying to get something to eat. They're pretty pragmatic about those kind of things. So I was watching that as I walked out. I did not even look at the car. I just walked out with my eyes on that point and got to the back of the car, put my hand on the hatchback and pressed it down. As I pressed it down, I could detect some movement in that gap. And initially it looked just like a 15-foot wide hole in the side of the woods. And then the movement that I detected though really made me think, because the movement wasn't across that space. It wasn't coming out of that space. The movement that I saw that was moving directly downward towards the ground. And that's what had caught my eye. And I stared at it, and there was a shape in that space. Now we're talking about a 15-foot wide space with the canopy of the trees hanging down to about 5 feet, about right here on me. And it was kind of eerie at that point. I was looking at basically a brown shape against a black background. And it was illuminated just enough to make out some details. And the first thing that struck me was that this thing was massive. I could make out shoulders on it that came straight outward. And those shoulders had to be 3 feet wide, at least. And of course, in my mind, I'm seeing a bear. And I'm looking at this thing and saying to myself, what kind of bear has shoulders that stick straight out? Because bears are slope-shouldered, especially when they sit down, which appeared to be what it was doing. And it just did not click in my head. And I stared at this thing, trying to process this in my mind. What kind of bear looks like that? And as I looked at it, I could make out knees that sort of stuck up at odd angles like that, and it looked as though the thing was crouching. And this just added to the confusion. And I was saying to myself, what kind of bear sits like that? Because bears don't do that. They sit down on their haunches the way a dog does, or they just sit right down on their behind and their feet stick out. And I'm saying, and this thing was basically, it looked like it was crouching like a baseball catcher. And I was so puzzled that I didn't realize at the time what I was experiencing was a psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. It's where your brain is getting input, it's getting information, it's getting data, and you just can't compute it. You just can't make it work up there. Because in my mind, I was looking at a bear. And I stared at it, and I stared at it. It must have been 40 feet from me. And I really couldn't figure out what kind of bear I was looking at. And it didn't dawn on me that there's possible dangerous animals sitting right there or anything like that. I was just so puzzled by what I was seeing. And after about a minute or so, my girlfriend at the time came to the back door, and I hear her say, "What are you trying to do, get killed?" And that snapped me right back to reality. And I realized there's a huge bear sitting right there 40 feet away. And I've got about 25 feet to cover to get back into this house. And the times that I had spent in the woods, I've been in there enough to know you don't run from a bear. That's the last thing in the world you do when you see one. So I just decided to back up. And I just backpedaled for about 10 feet with my eyes on this creature. And after about 10 feet, it didn't move. So I figured, okay, and I just turned around and walked into the house. Got inside, no problems. We stayed up to make sure there was no problems with the bear or anything like that. Nothing came of it. Didn't really think a lot of it. I had a couple of discussions with people after, days after that. A couple of guys I knew that were hunters, and I told them there's this massive bear out there, and they just didn't believe me. No, there was no bear that big. They ever said, the big bears out there get 300, 350 pounds. They don't get really big. So fast forward 5 years now. Okay, 5 years in 2005, I was no longer dating that young lady. I had met the woman that had become my wife, and we had moved to Orlando, Florida. And one of the things that I work with on, or have to deal with on a regular basis, is insomnia. And one night couldn't sleep. I'm up middle of the night flipping through the TV channels. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I come across a documentary show on Bigfoot. And up until that point in my life, I would be what you would call a Bigfoot agnostic. Not really thinking about it, just hearing stories, they seem like wild stories. Literally said the words, "This will put me to sleep," and started to watch this show. About 15 minutes into the show, a gentleman from Washington comes on and starts to explain his encounter, which was he believed he heard a noise out on his deck, and ran out on his deck to see what was out there, and turned to see a Bigfoot crouching in the corner where the railing of his deck met the house. And the description he gave of what he saw was about a 95% match to what I remembered having encountered that night 5 years before. And at that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I broke out into a cold sweat. My hands began to shake. And I got up and walked into the bathroom to splash some water on my face, and all the color had drained from my face. The impact of that realization hit me like a jackhammer. And what I didn't understand at that point was that I was experiencing what's called stress response. And it is your body and your brain's response to what is a perceived threat, what is something that could harm you. And that whole process was taking me over at that point. I mean, I was scared out of my mind, realizing of what it was that was sitting 40 feet from me and what it could have done to me had it wanted to. That was really the beginning of the journey going through there, or going through what where I've been the last 19 years. That's been the basis of my, pretty much the basis of my work for the last 8 years. Is exclusively that stress response that people have when it comes to these encounters. And what I will tell you is that every time I have encountered these creatures, I've gone through some form of that, some level of that, because there's a spectrum of these responses that you can have. Some of them are more intense than others, just like there are any other events that people go through, like traumatic car accidents or they're witness to acts of violence or things like that. Your body responds, your brain responds the same way. And the next time I did that, the next time I went through that was in 2011. We had moved here to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I had met a couple of gentlemen online that were doing research up in the Four Corners area. That's where Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah all come together at that, those square corners. And they were working about an area somewhere around 50 miles outside of Silverton, Colorado, in southwest Colorado. They had been doing research like that, so they had invited me up to join them. And I believe it was the third time that I had gone out with them. They had an idea to see if it would, to see if this particular technique would work. Their idea was they had isolated a small canyon out that way because that's right in the foothills of the Rockies. And what they were doing was put someone in a tree stand at one end of this canyon, and then have their party down way at the other end of the canyon, and then have people on each face of the canyon walk up and just basically drive whatever's in there down towards the person in the tree stand. And I got nominated to be the person in the tree stand, which didn't feel very good because when I looked at it, the tree stand was only 12 feet off the ground. And that was a very uncomfortable place as far as as far as being a Bigfoot researcher, because these things get to be 8 feet tall or more sometimes. So I didn't feel really good about it, but it was one of those tree stands that you could traverse it up the tree. And I got that thing up to about 25 feet, and I said, okay, I feel better this way. It just felt better to be up there. So they left me there, and the place where they were starting was about 2 miles away, and they had to drive back down there, via a road that was there. So it took a while for them to get everything together and get going, and it took about 2 hours before I could really start to hear anything happening off in that direction. If you've ever been in the woods at night and just sat there quietly, it's amazing the distance you can hear and what you can make out and everything. And I started to be able to hear them. It was, a step here and there, or, just talking to each other or whatever, because they weren't being very worried. They weren't too worried about the noise they were making. The idea was to drive everything my direction anyway. So they were just normal talking and everything like that. And it became, evident that I could hear them pretty well. And that's when I started to hear some animals move. I'm pretty sure one thing that ran through there was an elk, because it didn't hesitate, and there were 4 footfalls, and it was just trotting through there. So it was trying to get out of that area. Some smaller animals and things like that. So it was, as far as that goes, it was working. And then I started to be able to hear one particular thing amongst the others, where something would run a bit and then stop, and then run a bit and then stop. And I heard this about 3 times. And when it took off the 4th time, I realized I was hearing 2 footfalls. I wasn't hearing the ba-bump, 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 ba-bump that you get with the 4 footfalls. It was just 2 footfalls, like someone was running. And I immediately, it clicked into my head, that excitement, that adrenaline rush that we call, and it's also something that your brain does. Adrenaline is great for your body and gets it fired up that way. What does that for your brain is a chemical called cortisol that's released from the amygdala in your brain, and it just gets your brain fired up the way the adrenaline gets your body fired up. And I felt that response. I felt that exhilaration. And this noise would run and stop and then run and stop. And then I could hear one time it stopped, I could hear heavy breathing as though something had been running. I was so clued into this thing. I was so locked in. It was just off to my right, about maybe 10 degrees to my right. And then it took off running again, and it seemed to come very close to my location. I don't think it got under the tree I was under, but it was close. And I could hear this heavy breathing, as though this thing had really been hauling it, through the woods. And at that point, I didn't have any night vision gear or anything like that. That's not really what we were doing. I was basically a listening post. And I realized that I was not prepared to record anything. And I wanted to get an audio recording of this breathing. And I started fumbling through my pocket for my phone. And in the process of that, made some noise. And this thing just took off running. And it was about 35 minutes after that or so that the rest of the party that I was with got there. And I explained to them, yeah, you were right, because these fellows were doing some really good work up there, and they had found this area to do that experiment, and it worked really, really well. So I came out of that night understanding that level of excitement that you feel, that you just get so pumped up. And what I realized is that the fear of anxiety, or the feeling of anxiety and fear, kind of brings it's like the same energy that you get when you're excited about something. It's that electricity that goes through your body, and you're pumped up, and you get ultra focused on something. And that was, I didn't realize it then, but that became a real mainstay in the work that I would do. Now, it was after that I started doing a lot of solo research on my own here in New Mexico, looking for my own area to do some research in. And I'd seen a newspaper report where a town in northern New Mexico had experienced a sudden spike in missing dogs and cats. And they couldn't understand what was going on. Well, anybody who's been around the woods enough knows that there's a predator around. And these animals are easy prey for a predator. And I thought, well, there have been reports out of that area before. Maybe I should go check it out. And I spent 2 years researching that area. And there's a national park that's right up in that area as well.
Rich, can you share with me what that area is called? Just the general area? I know you don't want to give away the exact location.
This particular area, this is a national park. Jemez is where I'll tell you is the area that you want to go to. It's Jemez, Jemez. And that general area is renowned to have some activity up there. And unfortunately, I found some for myself, which, again, I'm not going to advise anybody to ever go out there the way I did, because that was, in a word, stupid. And, I wasn't even prepared for the animals that we know about, much less anything else. And it was just foolish for me to be out there by myself and do what I did. And this town sits close enough to it. And I started examining the area between this town and that park, thinking that maybe they're holed up in this park, and then they come out at night to forage, and saw enough signs, saw enough tree breaks, enough impressions in the ground, not really footprints, but impressions in the ground or impressions in grassy areas, to think that, yeah, maybe there's something to this. And so what I did was, there were long depressions in the ground that would lead out of this park out into the surrounding area. And I focused on one in particular that was bigger than the rest. It was maybe 300-400 feet long and maybe 100 feet wide. And I really don't want to call it a canyon or anything. It was just basically a depression. It was about maybe 30 feet deep. And it was, it looked like it had been made through water erosion naturally or something like that. And I was like, okay, that would make sense. That's cover coming out. You walk down through that and you're covered. Nobody's going to see where you do. And it just made sense to me. And so I decided to stake that out one night, which I'm not going to recommend anybody do something like this, because the park closed at dusk every day. So no one was allowed in after dark. And I hiked in about 45 minutes before sundown and got to this depression, this groove in the ground, I guess, and started picking up deadfall. And I built a blind that was, about 4 feet high or so. And that's what I was going to sit behind and just watch and listen. And you have to understand the mindset that I had. I was so proud of myself for having done all this research, and I'm sitting there telling myself that I was going to be the man. I was going to be this guy who was going to be rich and famous, and I was going to solve the mystery. I was just going to be the man. And it turned out to be that I knew just enough to get myself in trouble. And I got in trouble that night, because sitting there behind this blind all evening, and then when we get into the wee hours of the morning, and everything had really quieted down. And I think it was around 1:45 or so, I heard this howl in the distance. And it sounded too deep to be a coyote. And there are no wolves in that area of New Mexico. So I thought that was interesting. And then a few minutes later, I heard another one. And it really was just a long howl. And I call it kind of a sounding. It's like, hey, I'm here. Where's everybody else? That kind of thing. The second one seemed to be a little bit closer. And then it took about a half an hour. And I heard a third one. And it was definitely closer. And a few minutes after that, a fourth one that seemed to be about a mile away or so. And immediately the excitement started again. Maybe I'll get my chance. Maybe this is it. About 30 minutes later, this was long about 3:30 or so, I could hear walking through the woods. 2 footfalls. Boom, 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 boom. Coming through the woods. And it seemed like it was getting close. And then when it seemed like it was going to be right on top of me, it stopped. And there was this dead silence for just a couple of minutes. And at that point, I could hear this stomping from side to side. It started going back and forth. And that's when the forest kind of lit up. When I say the forest lit up, I mean animals started scurrying. I could hear birds, I could hear squirrels, I could hear whatever getting out. It seemed like they were just getting out of Dodge. They were heading out. And then I started to hear it. I started to hear these barks and these growls. And they were directed they're directed at me. And what literally struck me about these things is that I was sitting just high enough to have my face above the blind. These vocalizations were so strong I could feel the sound waves hitting me in my face. And it scared the daylights out of me. Because the picture is, I'm sitting there in the middle of the woods. I have no night vision gear. I have no idea, how I was intending to really bring back any evidence that was going to be any kind of consequential proof of anything. And I also realized that I was sitting there and all I had to protect myself with was a can of bear spray and a camping knife. And it was at that moment that I realized I had gotten myself in over my head. Because, the best I could see was maybe 20 feet or so. And in the night, I could really make out anything with the limited moonlight that was there or anything like that. So I couldn't see a lot. I had a flashlight, but if you use your flashlight in the middle of the night, you lose any night vision that you have at all. And it takes a long time to get your eyes to adjust back to it. So I didn't want to do that. And this thing is traversing around my position. It was about a 270-degree arc that this thing kept going around there. And my thought was, it's trying to scare me away. It's trying to get me out of here. And so the only thing I could think of at that point was, you don't let an angry animal behind you. So what I was sitting on was a 5-gallon bucket that had one of those lids that had a seat cushion on it. And so all I did was I kept rotating to face where the noise was coming from. I didn't want to let this creature behind me. And when I said before it was stomping, I know it was stomping because I could feel the vibrations in the ground, that this thing was just pounding down on the ground and it was trying to intimidate me and get me out of there. And then it made a noise that it's hard to describe. It sounded like an angry gurgling sound, almost like someone was rolling an R, but deep in the throat, not with the tongue like you usually would, but kind of deep in the throat. And I kept feeling these sound waves hitting me, going, wow, okay. I mean, it was blowing my mind. And again, my brain is firing now. I'm into this stress response. I'm into this ultra detailed thing. And all I was focused on was facing where the noise was coming from. And this went on for about 40 minutes. Back and forth, and just it would stop and then growl and then bark and then whatever. And it occurred to me that this thing could just roll over there and do whatever it wanted to do to me at that point. Then I distinctly heard the branch of a tree get snapped off. Just that pop of a fresh limb coming off a tree. And I said to myself, it's going to come over here and beat the daylights out of me with that. And within 7 or 8 seconds, this branch lands off to my left, about 8 feet or so off to my left, with a big thump. And after that, I could hear the walking going back into the woods, back where it had come from. More growls, more barks, whatever. And I'm just sitting there trying to stay facing it, trying to hold it all together. And finally, it walked off in the distance and I couldn't hear it anymore. Well, by this time, it's about 4:30 in the morning. And of course, I want to get out of there. But I don't want to lose my night vision, use my flashlight, so I don't want to do that. I have no idea where I'm going. I could run right into the side of a tree, which I've seen people do. It's not pretty. And so I just sat there. I was going to wait for first light. And it was about an hour, 15 minutes to an hour and a half in that range. And that seemed like an eternity, sitting there in the dark. With a few bugs and a few birds. That's all I heard. And in my mind, I'm running through the scenario. He's just going to go get his buddies and come back and finish me off, or however it's going to work. And I'm just sitting there listening and listening and listening. And then the sunlight started. Then the started to get enough light to be able to understand that it was close. That the time for me to get going was close. And as soon as I could see well enough, I started gathering up my gear, getting it all together, getting ready to get out of there. And as I'm doing that, I glance over to my left and I look at this branch that was thrown at me. And the branch was about 6 inches wide at the base. And it was about 8 or 9 feet long. That branch had to weigh 70 or 80 pounds. And my best estimation was that this thing was 20 to 25 yards from me. So throwing it 70 feet or so, that takes an incredible amount of strength. And it just scared me even more. Something that's capable of doing that. So it had taken me about 45 minutes to hike into this area. I turned that into a 20-minute jog out of there. All I could do was just keep going and keep going and keep going. I couldn't even look back. I didn't want to look back because I didn't want to see what might be there. Go through there and I get back to my car, load up all my gear in my car, sit down in the driver's seat with the key in my hand, and I'm going to sit here and tell you that I am not too proud to say that I cried like a baby. All the stress and everything that I was feeling, I'd been able to hold it together long enough to get back to the point where I felt it was over. And all that stress just poured out of me. I was terrified, absolutely terrified of what was going on and what I'd been through and what I had done to myself. I had put myself in that position. And it was a really dumb thing to do. And I don't, to this day, I don't go out in the woods by myself. I won't ever do it again. It's just not a smart thing to do. major lesson learned, another major stress point that you're talking about going through with this. And it's humbling. It was a very humbling experience. So later on, I went back to keep doing my research. And late in 2016, one of the things that I do, like a lot of researchers do, is that we look at social media, and there's a lot of groups for Bigfoot enthusiasts and researchers and everything. And I take a look at these pages and these groups, trying to just monitor them, trying to glean information and everything like that. Well, I find an ad for what's called a Bigfoot convention. It's one of these conferences that it's a gathering of people that are enthusiasts, and you have speakers and everything like that. But there was no location information on it. It was just some local directions. And I didn't know if it was near me or not. And there was a phone number on there. And I decided to call to see if there was any, there's any information on how close it was to me. Gentleman picks up on the other end, and I find out his name is Craig Salk. So I'm talking with Craig, and we just met, and we ended up talking for 3 hours, which is what happens when you get people in this community that are really interested in the subject and want to learn, and trying to get to the bottom of the mystery.
Yeah.
So we're talking, and we get through that, and I said, we got to do this again. And he says, absolutely. And we ended up talking 4 or 5 more times over a period of about a month, and each of them was 3 or 4 hours in length. And his wife thought he was crazy, and my wife thought I was crazy, and we're all going through that. And then he called me one night in February of 2017 and said, look, I'm having this convention in June. Would you come up here and be a speaker at the convention? And up until that point, all my research had been just for me, just for my benefit, my knowledge, because I was just trying to figure out the truth. I was just trying to figure out what I had encountered. And I hadn't really thought about sharing it with anybody. And he ended up talking me into it. So in June of 2017, I fly up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I get to meet this group of people. There's 400 people sitting there. So you get to speak to the group. And it was around this same time that I had realized there was a correlation that was happening in front of me. And at that point, I was working as a paraprofessional in the mental behavioral health field, working with kids that had behavior challenges and emotional disturbances and things like that. And what I had come to notice was that the things that I heard from those people on a daily basis, as far as the after effects, the issues that they were dealing with, nightmares and night terrors, and all different anxiety levels, and different things like that they had to deal with, I was hearing kind of the same things from Bigfoot witnesses, because I knew personally how jarring that experience can be, and how much it can just take you from your comfort zone and just permanently remove you from it. And you've got to cope, and you've got to find a way forward. And in talking to a bunch of people there, and talking with my friend Craig, I came to the conclusion that, this is a subject that needed real study. And I couldn't just come out and say these things were there, because I'm a person who's very tough on people who make conclusions without any real evidence, without any real effort or discipline put into it. Up until I had gotten into the Bigfoot phenomenon, I was somebody who liked to watch the stars. I was into astronomy. I really loved it. And I took the same approach from that, and the same approach that I had in my daily work, and started applying it there. And I decided to study just what those after effects were with Bigfoot witnesses, and how they compared to the ones you typically see from that were a result of events that were more commonplace, like the car accidents, like witnessing violence, like abuse, things like that. And I spent the next 3 years, basically, from early 2017, all through that into 2019, interviewing people. And I interviewed over 400 people for this study. I ended up going through there. Once I had all that, I had originally wanted to have 500 subjects in this study. And after almost 3 years, it turns out, well, I had interviewed 400 people, and I was really worn out because it was constant contact, because most of these people I talked to 2 or 3 times. And it became, a daily grind of going through this. And I talked to maybe 4 or 5 people in a day sometimes. So I had to really take it there, and I looked at what I had, and then that's when I said, okay, this is 400 interviews is enough. Let me start going through this. And what I began doing was vetting those people and going through there and really setting some standards for what data I was going to use on this study. And I ended up keeping 148 of those cases, and I compiled the data and really analyzed it and found that there's a real correlation between the after effects that people feel from more commonplace events to the after effects that you feel from these encounters, and not just encounters with Bigfoot. I don't know if you've heard of the phenomenon called dog man. It's kind of a Bigfoot, but it's a wolf. It's basically a dog man. It's like a werewolf.
Yeah.
I talked to some people that had those experiences. I talked to a few people that had alien experiences, and included some of them in the study as well, so we could have a little variety to it. And it was profound. It really was. And I was really surprised that these things correlated so tightly. And the one thing that I did realize was that the major difference between people that had more typical typical experiences that cause these after effects compared to the Bigfoot witnesses was that the people that had the more commonplace experiences didn't want to talk about their experiences. They didn't want to talk about what they went through. And that is because retelling is reliving. And you have to unearth all that and bring it back up. And anybody who has been through these type of things will tell you the memories are detailed and vivid. And they will tell you about details that you would think there's no earthly reason why somebody should realize, something like, the color of the chair in the building next to your car accident. Some people notice things like that. It's really profound, and they have to go through these responses all again. They have to relive their experiences again. But when it comes to Bigfoot witnesses, these folks have had the same type of impact in their lives, but they do want to talk about it. They want to tell somebody almost immediately. They want to share this experience because it's one of these things where you're not going to believe this. You got to hear this. But the only thing that affects them more is the fear of ridicule, the harassment and abuse in some cases that these folks go through for telling their stories. And that terrifies them enough to where they hold these stories in and they don't tell people. I'm almost finished writing a book that's going to be released next month about this subject. And one of the gentlemen that was a part of this study, and he let me use the story for the book, had an experience when he was 22 years old. And he didn't tell anyone about it until he was 58, so 36 years. He sat on this experience. And this impact on his life was immense. He was terrified so much by his encounter that he never went back to the property that he had his encounter on before. And that property was owned by a good friend of his. And he never went back. He never went back to that individual's house over 36 years. The road that particular property was on was the road he drove to work every day. He altered his route that took him 20 minutes longer each way to go to work for 20 years. Again, you're talking nightmares, you're talking anxiety, you're talking all kinds of the stress responses that you would think, sleep deprivation, all that kind of stuff. All of it happened to this guy. And now think about what brings those memories back. A certain sound can do it. Maybe a smell can do it. Maybe somebody talking about a certain subject can do it. It happened. There's so many triggers for folks to be able to, trigger those memories again. And again, with Bigfoot witnesses, those memories are just as detailed and just as vivid as you would have with anybody else who's gone through such a stressful place. And they have to go through this again. And this fella went through this for 36 years. That's over 13,000 days of being a prisoner to these effects and to these feelings that he went through. And had he not seen a couple of posts that I had made and a couple of conversations that I had with some folks in these Bigfoot groups, he would still be sitting on that, because he said something in his mind told him to talk to me. And he needed really to unburden his story. And it's amazing what this fellow went through. He got married after this encounter and never told his wife about it, ever.
Wow.
So yeah, post reveal, his life is very different than what he went through for those 36 years. And there's really no roadmap for that. And I tried to tell him that, and I said, you're just gonna have to find out for yourself and figure out who you trust. Because that's a big part of the experience that witnesses go through, is finding out who really cares about you in your life. And my initial encounter, when I realized that 5-year gap after that, when I realized what I'd gone through, I went into what people would call a stupor. Didn't engage people, didn't talk to people, wasn't really, focused in on anything. I was just into my own mind. And I did this for 3 days, just going through the motions of my life and, absolutely not making eye contact with people and having a difficult time. And what you don't realize is that when you go into this level of stress response, it takes you to a state of mind that's very, very close to ADHD. Your mind is basically geared on one thing, focused on one thing, and that is what you need to do to protect yourself, what you need to do to feel comfortable. And I would notice mundane details and things like that, and I was very irritable. I got confused very easily. And after 3 days, my wife had told me, come up to me and just stopped me and said, look, something's wrong with you. What's going on? That's when I told her what I call the words. I've come to call these the words. And that's what somebody says when they're about to reveal their story to someone. And those words are, I just don't think you're going to believe me. And that's the witness giving that person the out of saying, okay, well, I don't want to talk about it anyway, so that's okay. But if a person cares about you, they'll do what my wife at the time did. And she said, look, just tell me. This is a lady who worked with the United States Forest Service for a lot of years. She worked in government service for a long time. She never, ever revealed to me what she thought about Bigfoot, whether she believed in it or not, or anything else, or that everybody else does. But what drove her was the fact that she could see the impact it had on me, how much it had just crushed me on an emotional level to the point where I was nowhere near myself. If a witness is lucky, there's somebody like that in their lives, somebody that cares for them. And I really, the work that I've done for the last 8 years has been geared on making that happen and, getting across to people and really studying this facet of the phenomenon. And I had one person tell me something I hadn't realized. And they said, without one of these creatures on an examination table or in a cage somewhere to be able to study, you have nothing left to study except the people. The people involved in it are the phenomenon. It's their perceptions and their experiences, and how those experiences affect them is a huge, huge thing. So I go through all these machinations and I find out all this information, and the studies really eye-opening. And then my buddy Craig calls me again and he says, hey, we're doing another convention this year. Do you want to come back? And he knew I'd been working on my study. I said, well, I'm really in the middle of compiling all this stuff. Why don't I come up there and release my study? And so we agreed, and I was back up there in the summer of 2019 and released my study to the public and released its findings. And, it was an amazing day. I published it, I believe, on 18 different Facebook groups that day. And the funny thing about it is, whenever somebody puts a theory out there or some sort of idea out there in the Bigfoot community, it usually gets roasted. And I was totally prepared for this. I released it on all these pages, and I said, okay, bring it on. Here it comes. And the funny thing about it was I got zero blowback on it. Nobody really had, an awkward word or even an awkward word to say about it, which surprised me incredibly. Usually there's somebody who's going to destroy it, try and cut it up or anything like that. And I figured out that, I at least did solid science with it. And I wasn't giving some idea. I was giving them data. I was providing the data, and it was supported by all the work that I had done. And it was very, very gratifying to go through that, people recognize that work and everything. So that was an amazing day. So the next day I'm flying home, and I'm staying on that property of my friend Craig Sulk and his wife Barb. And their home on this property is very small. It's basically a hunting cabin. So they had borrowed a camper from a friend and parked it in their driveway, and that's what I got to stay in. And of course it was a late night, and I got to sleep late. And about 3 or so in the morning, a noise woke me up. And it sounded like a thump. I don't think I felt a vibration or anything. I just heard a noise. And it kind of woke me up, and I'm sitting there, my eyes trying to open and trying to figure out what that noise was. And then I heard another noise. And in the state I was in, just having woken up, I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was like this gurgling sound, and then it stopped, going for 4 or 5 seconds, and it stopped. And it did this about 3 times, and I'm just puzzled as to what this thing could be. What is that? And then it came on a 4th time, and my eyes went wide. I realized what it was. It was a sound of a stomach growling. It is that gurgle that you get. And my eyes opened up because there's so much Bigfoot activity on Craig's property. And I thought maybe, and this camper, of course, there's a central aisle down every camper, and then everything's positioned one side or the other. And the bed area of this one was in the back. And the bed was only 6 feet long, and I'm 6'2". So I was sleeping catty corner on this bed, which put my head right in the back corner of the camper. There's a window up to my left, and it's covered by a curtain. And that's the general direction that the noise was coming from. And I reached up to grab that curtain and pull it out, and I hit the middle of the curtain rather than the bottom edge to pull it up. And I fumbled with it a little bit, and my fingers were hitting the window. And I pulled it open, and there's just blackness in this window. There's no light, nothing at all. And then in a moment, boom, it's open, and I can see stars, and I can see the trees around, and the silhouettes of the trees around in the moonlight and everything like that. So it had gone from being completely covered, which this window from where I was sitting in this camper, my head was probably 6 feet off the ground, in relation to the ground, and looking up, and the window had been blocked. And then all of a sudden it was open, and it startled me. And I sat up in the bed, and I looked down the length of the camper, because that's the direction that this shape had gone. And I looked down to the front of the camper, and the camper had 2 windows at the front of it, but it had those outside covers you could raise and lower, kind of cantilevered. And they were open a bit, and I could see about 6 inches at the bottom of each window. And I saw this dark shape cross between the camper and the truck in front of it. And immediately I wanted to get up and run out there and go look at this thing. And I stopped, and I said, I'm barely awake. and I'm on ground that I'm not familiar with. I don't know this ground very well. And the last thing in the world I want to do is go running out in the woods without, any protection or any plan whatsoever, because there are bears on that property. He baits the deer to get there to draw in bears. So all that popped into my mind. I said, I'm better off just sitting here. And again, that exhilaration, that excitement, that electricity's in my body. And so if you can picture, a 6'2" former power lifter walking up and down the aisle, back and forth, pacing in this camper, trying to burn this energy. And I sat down and I did what I ask every witness I talk to do, and that's to write out exactly what you just experienced. Every detail you can think of, everything like that, and put it down on a piece of paper. And not only does it get the encounter documented, it gets it to a point where it's no longer just happening in your head. The encounter now exists somewhere else other than your head. And that's important to be able to distance yourself from it and put it at a correct perspective to be able to do that. And it's the same thing that we used to do with trauma victims and, in other cases. So I did that. And then there's first light, and I kept watching the house to see when the lights were going to come on. About 5:30, the lights came on, and I stepped out, rapped on the door, and said, "Guess what?" And we had to go through that. My friend Craig and I looked around the camper. Unfortunately, it was in his driveway. His driveway wasn't paved, but it had been used so much, everything was pounded flat. So there's no impressions to be made or anything like that, no footprints. We checked the area between the truck and the camper for any evidence at all, for footprints or anything, or hairs that could be out there, and nothing. So that was, the day after this convention. Had it been the night I got there, that would have been an incredible story to tell at this convention. But the great part is that I was able to relate that to folks, and we're talking about it. And I'm actually going back up there this summer to be a speaker on a panel that they have going up there again. They've invited me back again, and it's an area that I just love because the folks are, they're just wonderful people up there, just the nicest folks you could think of being around. And the crowds that you get at their gathering are enthusiastic and hungry to learn, and it's a lot of fun. So I'm really going to look forward. I'll be up there on June 1st this summer, and I'll be promoting my book. Like I said, my book is coming out in February 15th, and I'll be doing a lot of appearances and talking to people about it. The book is entitled Footprints in the Mind, the Bigfoot Witness Experience. And it refers to the fact that these memories are akin to the footprints everybody looks for. These memories are made in people's minds, and they stay there. Where, people look for the footprints, these are footprints in the mind. And it really details a lot of the things that I've described there about, the cortisol releasing in your brain and the physical sensations and the things that you go through. And I use some stories of people that I've interviewed to be able to illustrate those different points. And it's, and it's something that I'm doing. I want people that have gone through this experience, and the people those that are afraid to share their stories, to feel some validation, to feel that there's somebody who understands what's going on. There are people out here that really get what they're going through. And I hope it encourages them, and I hope it helps them at least process a little bit and put their experiences in perspective. And hopefully they'll find somebody that'll really listen to them and help them process their way to a road to recovery, because that's the big thing. That path of recovery is huge to get through. Otherwise, they're just in this vicious cycle that they get stuck in. They want to talk about it. They want to let it go, but they can't, because they're so afraid of the ridicule. And the stigma around the Bigfoot phenomenon is real, and it's severe in some cases. A couple of the people that I spoke to for my study actually lost their jobs for sharing their stories at work, and that's how severe it can be for some folks.
as you can see, the match has gone out, and as the smoke clears, I feel like it's mixed with the steam of those Jemez Springs. I can still smell those ponderosa pines. I hope you enjoyed that Jemez Mountain encounter, and if you'd like to see some of that research Rich has done, I have it linked in the show notes. Also, Ingrid Lane, the missing person from earlier in the episode, her case remains unsolved. So I wanted to say, she's a white woman with brown hair, hazel eyes, 5 feet 5 inches, 120 pounds, and she was last seen wearing a gray fleece jacket, black jogger pants, and a gray knit hat. If you have any information regarding her disappearance, please contact the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office at 505-867-7526 or the National Park Service tip line at 505-709-0077. That's case number 23-001710. But that's it for me. Please give the show a 5-star rating. It only takes one click and it really helps the show grow. Also, if you have an unusual story, reach out to me. My email is alec@parasaur.co. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for stopping by, and I hope you come back next week because I have another match to light.